NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Thank you for joining our training today. This training is supported by grant number 2019-YA-BX-K001, awarded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. The Bureau of Justice Assistance is a component of the Department of Justice's Office of Justice Programs, which also includes the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Institute of Justice, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Office for Victims of Crimes, and the SMART Office. Points of view or opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. I will briefly introduce our presenters so we can get right to their presentation. For their full bios, click the link in the chat box. Both presenters are with NYU's Center on Violence and Recovery. Crystal McLeod is the Associate Director of Development and Education and oversees planning, development, and implementation of the NYU Center on Violence and Recovery's Restorative Justice model for domestic violence crimes. Dr. Brianna Barakos oversees the NYU Center on Violence and Recovery's research initiatives and is also a research associate professor at the Silver School of Social Work. And with that, I will turn it over to Crystal and Brianna.
Hello, and thank you. We are grateful for this opportunity to share our innovative work that we believe is already shifting domestic violence treatment as we know it. Today, we are going to be talking about restorative justice and domestic violence crimes, the Circles of Peace model, with a focus on practice, policy, and research. Here is an overview of what we will be talking about today. We'll provide some background, who we are, and some context for our work. We'll then talk about applying restorative justice principles and practices to domestic violence. Then we'll focus on our Circles of Peace model, which is a restorative justice evidence-informed approach. And finally, we'll end with lessons learned from 18 years of doing this work. So background. So New York University's Center on Violence and Recovery is a research center dedicated to advancing knowledge on the causes and consequences of violence and trauma and developing solutions that foster healing among individuals, families, and communities. To achieve our mission, we innovate, we study, and we educate. Over the past 18 years, we've collaborated with judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, treatment providers, victim advocates, and community members. Since 2004, we've been searching for the optimal treatment approach to domestic violence. Before moving on, I just want to comment on terminology. Specifically, domestic violence in the legal context is broadly defined to include intimate partner violence, family violence, and we're focusing on adults here. So family violence means an adult, child, and parent, as an example. And in some states, it can also include roommates. So domestic violence is often used as in a catch-all manner, and we just want to be clear on this terminology. And when we're talking about domestic violence, we're using the broad definition. When we're talking about other types of violence, we'll be using the other terms. And then also, I want to note that so in general, restorative justice seeks to avoid defining people by their behaviors and experiences with terms such as victim and offender. So preferred terms in restorative justice include the person who has caused harm and the person who has been harmed. Moving on now to applying restorative justice principles and practices to domestic violence. So I just want to do a quick overview of different types of restorative justice approaches, in part because I want to situate where our work has been within these different types of approaches. So there's victim offender mediation or dialogue, which involves the person, the harmed person, the person who has caused harm, and is a facilitator or a mediator. Then there's family group conferencing, which involves the person who has caused harm, the person who has caused harm's family or supporters, facilitators, and sometimes the harmed person or the harmed person's representative. And then peacemaking circles involves the person who has caused harm, the harmed person, family or supporters, a facilitator, and sometimes community representatives. So our model has been a peacemaking circle model. So that's where, our presentation is going to be focusing on a peacemaking approach. And it's a way of bringing together people to understand one another, strengthen bonds, and solve community problems. The circle process is a storytelling process. Everyone has a story, and every story has a lesson to offer. And the circle model is flexible and can be implemented at different stages inside and outside of the criminal justice system. So here's a diagram that illustrates at the different points in time in which a restorative justice program can take place. Most of our work has been in the context of court referrals. So this diagram, as I said, it illustrates the different points in time that restorative justice can be done. So that's just, again, to provide the context for our work. I will now turn it over to Crystal.
Thanks so much, Brianna. So we know that domestic violence happens everywhere. Domestic violence is in every country, every community, every village and neighborhood. But what we often don't talk about is domestic violence is inexplicable link to many of the larger social issues we face today. More than half of mass shootings are linked to domestic violence. Research studies have shown that more than 2/3 of mass shootings are domestic violence incidents or are perpetuated by shooters with a history of domestic violence. Studies have also found a clear connection between domestic violence, gun violence, and crime in general. When we think about Sandy Hook and the recent Uvalde shooting in Texas, Sandy Hook began with a gunman killing his mother, a domestic violence incident. Similarly, with the shooting in Texas, it began with a gunman shooting his grandmother. So I think that's really important to discuss because we can no longer deny the interconnectedness between violence within the home and violence outside of the home and crime outside of the home. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight this quote by Dr. Gillian Peterson and James Densley that speaks to the intergenerational transmission of violence. So it says, in every case, literally whether it's parental violence against mom or physical abuse with a kid, she said, perpetrators' personal histories directly influence shootings. The worse the crime, the worse the story. I wanted to highlight this because this quote really speaks to the intergenerational transmission of violence. Studies have shown a link between past violent or traumatic experiences and externalized aggression, especially among men to varying degrees. Women, meanwhile, often engage in deliberate, non-suicidal, self-harming behaviors. 50% more frequently than do men. I think this is important to note because when looking at individuals who have experienced violence in the home and trauma, recognizing that folks can be even more predisposed to violence outside of the home. So I'll now, next slide. So this is a couple of quotes from original seminal work in the 80s and 90s to show the intergenerational transmission of violence, which I do want to define. It's the intergenerational transmission of violence is a concept that, children of violent offenders are more likely to become violent. So domestic violence is commonly passed on from one generation to another. Children who witness abuse between adults or experience violence directly learn the same behavior. And another quote, men who experienced or observed violence in their families of origin were 2 to 9 times more likely to become violence against their wives. Next slide. So DV in the United States, though we know that domestic violence is prevalent, broadly speaking, domestic violence accounted for 21% of all violence crimes in the USA between 2003 and 2012. The US prides itself on leading the way in formulating theories, court practices, and treatments to combat domestic violence, despite these widespread how widespread domestic violence remains. Next slide. So in order to situate this work, we have to understand what is the typical response to DV in the United States. So most misdemeanor DV offenders are court mandated to attend a domestic violence intervention program, which is traditionally known as a batterer's intervention program. It's important to note, though, that there is no scientific basis for this treatment mechanism. This is not an evidence-informed treatment mechanism. A lot of our reliance on batterer's intervention programs actually comes out of carceral feminism in the 70s and the 80s, where a lot of feminists were advocating for, and this was not intersectional feminism, this was primarily white feminism, feminists were advocating for carceral responses to crime, including domestic violence, at the expense of Black and Brown communities. That is what this work really comes out of. Sometimes also after time spent in jail or prison, someone will be sentenced to a batterer's intervention program. It's also important to note that, as Brianna discussed, every state has a different legal definition of DV regarding regulating bodies for offender treatment programs, minimum treatment lengths, facilitator education and training requirements, et cetera. And I think that's really important to consider as we go further into our work. Next slide. So more about batterer intervention programs. There are 2,500, more than 2,500 BIPs in the U.S. Many of these BIPs have adapted the Duluth model, which came out of Duluth, Minnesota, and this treatment model assumes abusive men are equally socialized. It's didactic. It's a didactic psychoeducational curriculum. It's guided by a feminist perspective and focused on changing sexist attitudes for the purpose of offering behavior change. In one national survey of BIPs, 93% of programs surveyed described as using the Duluth-oriented model. Next slide.
So the question becomes, do these programs work? So although earlier evaluations suggested that BIPs reduced battering, recent evaluations based on more rigorous designs find little or no reduction. And there's little effectiveness evidence that would favor one type of traditional intervention over another. More recently, there's new evidence that suggests combining BIPs with other treatment elements can improve overall effectiveness. An example of this is motivational interviewing.
So what were we looking for as we took stock of DV intervention? So we wanted an approach that addressed one-directional, two-directional family violence. Again, this broad conceptualization of domestic violence. We didn't want an approach that reprivatized violence. Often domestic violence, family violence is stigmatized. And so we wanted a community-based approach. We wanted something that could be adapted to multiple cultures and familial arrangements. When speaking about the Duluth model, one of the many critiques is that it is not culturally sensitive and does have a myopic view of domestic violence, often highlighting intimate partner violence and male offender, female victim dynamic, which we know that relationships are much broader than that. We wanted to provide voluntary participation by the victim. We also wanted to recognize that a cohabitation often continues in DV relationships. And we of course, safety was extremely important to us. We wanted to monitor safety in new ways. We wanted something that could interrupt disruptive intergenerational patterns. And finally, speaking to our evidence-informed approach, we wanted something that was evidence-based and adaptable to the local, to the needs of local jurisdictions. Next slide. So why restorative justice? So despite our legal system often adopting punitive measures, we cannot address violence with violence. And we understood that, especially when working with communities that have been historically disenfranchised and harmed by the criminal justice system. So we landed on RJ because RJ recognizes that crime and violence is a violation of people, that violations create obligations, and we then have an obligation to put things right. And finally, we wanted to believe that change is possible. But the question that, of course, was in our mind when conceptualizing this model was, could we apply these tenets to DV crimes? Next slide.
So now that we've talked about restorative justice principles and practices, we'd like to talk about our restorative justice model for domestic violence, the Circles of Peace model. So developing the model. In 2003, Linda Mills, who's the executive director of our center at NYU, published Insult to Injury, in which she proposed the use of using restorative justice to address domestic violence. Subsequently, in 2004, NYU Center on Violence and Recovery invited experts in both restorative justice and domestic violence to New York for a roundtable to discuss using restorative approaches for addressing domestic violence. 2 models were put forth as part of that roundtable: Circles of Peace, which is connected to the criminal justice system, and Healing Circles, which is not connected to the criminal justice system. In essence, the models are the same. It's just at sort of what point in time they're used. And our work has mainly been in the context of the criminal justice system, so it's been the Circles of Peace model.
So what is the Circles of Peace model? CP is the first program of its kind in the United States to use RJ principles to treat those arrested for domestic violence crimes broadly. Again, speaking to this broad conceptualization of domestic violence. So it brings individuals who have been abusive and the victim, if they choose to participate, together with willing family members, support persons, a trained professional facilitator, a CP trained community volunteers, all to monitor safety in order to seek a more effective treatment outcome. Circles of Peace encourage dialogue about the current and previous incidents, uncover gender dynamics and family history, and create longer term change. So again, in Circles, this idea of fostering individual problem solving, empowerment, tailor safety and planning to the cultural, religious, and socioeconomic needs of everyone involved. As Brianna spoke about earlier, as soon as folks enter the program, they are those who are mandated to treatment are relabeled as responsible person upon acceptance to Circles of Peace. And that's important because, again, we're moving away from labeling people as victims or offenders and into this more neutral state where someone is able to take accountability, but not be characterized simply as what they did. It monitors behaviors through the use of a social compact, which is essentially an accountability plan. And offenders are then accountable to the promises they made. They engage with other circle members in the treatment process by committing them to supportive activities and improved family relationship dynamics.
So a brief history of Circles of Peace for domestic violence. So following the roundtable that I mentioned earlier, there was a judge in Nogales, Arizona, Mary Helen Maley, who had been a judge in the community for so long that it got to the point where she started seeing children of previous people she had seen once they were adults themselves and in their own intimate relationships coming into her court for domestic violence. And she decided that she needed to do something different in her community to address domestic violence crimes. And she picked up a copy of Linda's book, Insult to Injury, and reached out to us and said, I want to develop this program for my community. So that was in 2004. And at the same time, we got a grant from the National Science Foundation to do a randomized controlled trial comparing Circles of Peace to the standard batter intervention program in Nogales. In 2010, we received another grant from the National Science Foundation for a replication study comparing a Circle of Peace hybrid program with a standard batter intervention program in Salt Lake City. And in 2012, the National Institute of Justice granted us funding to do a qualitative study to complement the randomized controlled trial in Salt Lake City. In 2019, the Vermont State's Attorney developed a one-year Circles of Peace pilot program, and CVR was awarded a university research grant from NYU to study the program. And most recently, in 2020, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia expressed their interest in the Circles of Peace model, and CVR is developing a Circles program for DC with local partners, and that is set to hopefully launch this fall.
So how do we work? So we work with communities from the stage where restorative justice for DV is an idea to actually building out a program and holding it within the community. So here we have 6 stages of this work. There's the intake stage, springboard, development stage, a training stage, an implementation stage, and then finally a maintenance stage. And I'll go into what all of those mean. Next slide. So during intake, that's when we're doing a community needs assessment and verifying whether our program, our model is a match. So we're asking you questions like, what are your state standards? What's different with our work is that DV is a highly regulated space, and our work is dependent on the standards of the state. So for instance, in California, I believe a typical treatment, a typical treatment timeline is 52 weeks. And so we would work with you to create a program that then aligns with that treatment timeline. You're also, during that intake stage, figuring out if we're a match for you. And that's really important to us because we want to make sure that we're working with communities that our way of working works for. The next stage is the springboard stage, which can often be quite complicated because it's the initial stage where you're meeting with various stakeholders. And in order to seed a program within a community correctly, you have to speak with all of the stakeholders, get stakeholder buy-in, hear what it is that folks want, often talk about issues of mistrust, things that might be uncomfortable for certain communities. And so that a springboard stage can take quite some time because we want to be intentional about making sure to connect with all stakeholders involved. From then, once we have stakeholder buy-in, it's the development stage, where we're co-creating an RJ evidence-informed program built through modification based on local needs and state standards. And of course, creating a community-centered approach. One of the things I love about the Circles of Peace model is that it's flexible. And so during this time, we're learning you, you're learning us, and deciding what will work for your community. And we're co-creating a program based on that. Then during the training stage, providers are trained in the model and the specific program for their community. The expectation is after providers are trained that they would then be able to train community volunteers, victim advocates. It's a train the trainer approach. Finally, the implementation stage where the program is put into practice. And this is an iterative phase connected to the maintenance phase where NYU CVR provides ongoing technical assistance for community providers, and we're tweaking the program as folks are implementing the program. Next
So
slide.
here's an overview of the programs that have been implemented in the various communities that we've worked with. So in Nogales, Arizona, at the time that we worked with them, it was a Circles of Peace model only. First-time offenders in Arizona are mandated to 26 weeks of treatment. So it was 26 weeks of Circles of Peace, focusing on an individual case. In Utah, at the time of the study, the state standards required that domestic violence offenders have 12 weeks of offender-only group treatment before they could have any type of conjoint treatment. And at the time of the study, it subsequently changed, but first-time offenders were mandated to a minimum of 16 weeks of treatment. So the model in Utah was a hybrid approach in which it was 12 weeks of a batter's intervention program, followed by Circles of Peace focusing on an individual case. And that was 4 to 6 weeks. In both Arizona and Utah, the programs were done by domestic violence treatment providers. So these were treatment providers that were providing a standard batter intervention programs, and we're now doing Circles of Peace. In Vermont, the circles they made an exception in Vermont at the time that the program was implemented, and that Vermont was a state that did not allow for conjoint treatment where you bring together the two parties. So they made an exception for the 1-year pilot program, and subsequently the program was allowed to continue beyond the pilot year. And then more recently, the Vermont state standards actually changed. So the program in Vermont includes groups of offenders up to 4 in 6 circles done every other week. And then there's 2 maintenance circles at weeks 18 and 26. In Vermont, the program is done by a restorative justice treatment provider. So in Vermont, every county has a community justice center. So the treatment provider in Vermont had been using restorative justice to address other types of crimes previously, just not domestic violence. So in Vermont, conjoint circles are allowed if the offender has completed 3 offender-only circles. And then while an offender is doing the offender-only circles, victims can request a victim-only circle. Finally, in Washington, D.C., the Circles of Peace model there is 18 weeks. The District of Columbia doesn't have any standards related to domestic violence offender treatment. And the model that we've designed there, based on input from the community as well as our previous partners, was it's 2 community circles in which we bring together groups of offenders, sort of a cohort, as well as community volunteers and facilitators. Then it's followed by 10 educational circles, which this is the psychoeducational component of the process. Subsequently, then there's 6 joint circles, and at this point, the victim can participate if the victim chooses to participate. And the model in DC is going to be co-facilitated by a domestic violence clinician and a restorative justice expert. Now, as I begin to talk about our research, I'd like to start with this quote: "Take nothing on its looks, take everything on evidence, there's no better rule." And this is from Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. There's a lack of research evidence for the effectiveness of many of the most common domestic violence treatments. And this lack of evidence speaks to the importance of conducting rigorous studies such as randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials are the gold standard in research. Because of hesitation over using restorative justice in the context of domestic violence, if we were going to study the model, we were going to do the most rigorous studies possible. So this is why we've done randomized controlled trials. So our first study in Nogales, Arizona was a randomized controlled trial. We had 152 cases. Domestic violence in Arizona is defined as intimate partner violence and family violence. So it included both those types of cases. And cases were randomly assigned to either the standard batter intervention program or the Circles of Peace program, 26 weeks of either one of those. So the results of the study show that restorative justice can be a viable and safe option for domestic violence crimes. And the findings suggest also that participation in restorative justice does not automatically pose a security risk per se. So it debunks the claim that restorative justice is more dangerous than BIP in treating domestic violence crimes. The guiding principle in research is first cause no harm. So that's what we found in this study, that there was no difference in subsequent arrest between someone who went to Batter's intervention program and someone who went to Circles of Peace. And our study was published in 2013 in the Journal of Experimental Criminology. Moving on to Salt Lake City and our Utah studies. So we did a 2-part randomized controlled trial in Utah. Part 1 randomized all domestic violence offenders in Utah, broadly defined to include intimate partner, family, and violence, family violence and violence between roommates. And they were randomly assigned to either 18 weeks of a batter's intervention program or the hybrid approach with 12 weeks of BIP followed by 6 weeks of Circles of Peace. For part 2 of the Utah study, we focused on intimate partner violence cases only, and they were randomly assigned to either 16 weeks of BIP or the hybrid, which was 12 weeks of BIP followed by 4 weeks of Circles. We used different treatment providers in part 1 and part 2. So the standard practice for the treatment provider in part 1 was 18 weeks. The standard practice for the treatment provider in part 2 was 16 weeks. So that's why the lengths of time were a little bit different. And then we did the NIJ study, which was the qualitative study in which we gathered data to complement part 2 of the NSF randomized controlled trial, and we did interviews, observations, and a review of case records. So the results so far. Part 1 of our Salt Lake City study showed that BIP plus Circle results in significant reductions in new arrest and severity of crimes if a crime does occur. And the reductions were over 50% for both. So BIP plus CP is more effective than a BIP only approach, and restorative justice is a viable treatment option for domestic violence crimes. Our study with these results was published in 2019 in Nature Human Behavior. The NIJ qualitative study highlights the promise of this model, the desire to participate in treatment together, and the importance of the victim's perspective in the treatment process. So now I want to talk a little bit about victim participation. So in general, victims who participate in restorative justice programs tend to regularly report much higher levels of satisfaction with the process. So the victim participation rates in our studies, for the Nogales study, we had 62% victim participation. For part 1 in the Utah study, we had 42%, and for part 1 and part 2, we had 67%. Victim participation. So this speaks to the desire for victims to be involved in their offender's treatment. And if a victim chooses not to participate, victim advocates can represent a victim's voice. And so actually, as our program has, as our model has been implemented in various places over time, one of the changes has been that we now include victim advocates, trained victim advocates if a victim decides not to participate, not necessarily to represent the perspective of the victim in that case, but a victim in general. And then finally, victims' safety is paramount, and safety concerns are continually assessed and addressed as part of the restorative justice process. So now I just want to share some quotes from our qualitative work. So this one speaks to the victim's desire to participate. I wish I would have had the opportunity to actually do the treatment. You know, I'm kind of disappointed because I really think it may have helped. And the Circles of Peace program really fosters true change. Here's a quote from a male offender, and it says, "You know how it is when you're talking, you'll say something and you don't really know how the other person took it. And so, when that happens to me, I just ignore it because I know she didn't mean it. Same thing with her. It just bounces off now and we move on." So I think both of us kind of want this to just be in the past and kind of let it go. And it's not starting over. That's impossible, but it's moving on from here. And I know I had a choice in how I would handle that moving on. I could keep blaming, and that would have fallen into the same thing, but it's not like that anymore. Also, participating in a treatment process together opens up the possibility of continuing on in some type of conjoint treatment process. So here's another quote from a male participant in BIP plus circles. "I'd say the victim probably gained as much, if not more, out of the circle because I think there was a lot of good things that she hadn't really been thinking about either. Like I tell her what I gained, what I learned in my groups for the first 12 weeks, but having her actually involved, I think, was really big for her. And in return, that makes things better for me. I think we gained something out of it. If we can find it affordable, just thinking, counseling, or just talking to someone or having a third party is just a good thing for us in general." And then finally, this is a note from a clinician's note from a final session of an offender who was in BIP plus circles. And it highlights how the process allows the victim perspective to be included. "The victim was able to participate in this final session, and she was able to provide feedback, context, and her perspective to the process. We focused primarily on summarizing the skills, concepts from all the sessions, which included the following: what boundaries expectations look like for him and for his potential partners or anyone in his life, what enforcement of boundaries expectations can look like, and how he can communicate his wants, needs, emotions, thoughts to others in an effective way. His ex-partner was able to provide her feedback on his summary of what he has learned in treatment."
So we've learned a lot about this work over the last almost 2 decades, and we'd like to share a little bit with you about all that we've learned. Next slide. So we've learned a lot, particularly about the strengths of this approach. So the Circles of Peace model, as we've stated before, can address the broad range of cases that come into contact with the criminal justice system. I was speaking to one of the clinicians on our team, and we're talking about the criminal legal system's response sometimes. And she said something that really struck me. We'll know that one size doesn't fit all cases, but sometimes we just don't have an alternative. And so I think it's the same thing with BIP. And I think one of the strengths of our model is that this approach can address a variety of the cases that come into the legal system, including male offender, female victim, female offender, male victim, same-sex couples. And that's something that's super important to us. One of the strengths of this model is also our intensive process. So this is many circles over time. Because this work is dictated by state standards, offenders are being they're being able to experience what a restorative justice process looks like and what circles look like over time, which is a really important part of this model and a really important part of witnessing change over time. Victim participation is voluntary. Victims have the option to participate, but the use of a victim advocate, as Brianna mentioned before, is something that we've used in different communities. Also, our trained community volunteers. This is a really key component of the model because, as I spoke about earlier, this importance of not reprivatizing violence, it's important that we involve the community in how we address harm. And I think of one of our jurisdictions, in particular, Vermont, and they have a community of about 5 community volunteers that show up every week and have been there for quite some time. And so the community wants to be involved with someone's healing process, but often in the criminal legal system, that is not an option. Also, the adaptability, as Brianna spoke about before, we've done this. We've developed programs with communities, with clinicians, non-clinicians, and various system partners. So we've partnered with judges, prosecutors, and community stakeholders in order to seed this program in various communities. And of course, the evidence-informed approach. This is an evidence-informed approach, and that was really important to us in doing this work to have evidence and research support the work in which we are advocating for. Next slide. So what are some of the lessons that we've learned over time? Intervention programs for domestic violence crime is an area primed for innovation. We know that punitive responses to DV crimes are generally ineffective. And so we've seen such a strengthened interest to use the RJCP approach in the last couple of years, as folks recognize that a punitive response to DV crimes isn't working. Also, a great strength of the CP model, as I spoke about before, is the adaptability to diverse community needs, values, and cultural contexts, as well as state standards. This is a community-based and led participation is critical to our approach, and that's a part of our approach which we love. Also, the research reinforces that RJ is a compelling alternative to addressing DV crimes and repairing harm. And of course, now CP is an evidence-informed approach for domestic violence crimes. Next slide. So what does this work look like for us moving forward? So in September of 2021, we did a virtual convening with our partners across the country to share knowledge, get their input on what this work might look like moving forward. It was out of that convening that we, with recommendations from our community partners, that we built the DC program. One of the things that was stressed in that meeting was how can we create more opportunities for circles? So the DC program starts, as Brianna talked about, with community circles, the psychoeducational component, which is the standard BIP component that we have tweaked, is also in circle, the educational circles. And finally, it ends with joint circles. Also, we've thought and are working to, though we've primarily worked with adults, we're developing a program to address family violence with juvenile offenders, and are open to doing that work in other communities. Next slide. It's just CVR, we partner with organizations, individuals searching for more effective responses to domestic violence. We undertake education in the spiritness of flexibility, and we address concerns supporting our approach with the best evidence and research. A great strength of our model, as emphasized before, is the adaptability to each community's needs, values, and cultural context. And in all our education efforts, we take care to address safety mechanisms in all of our circles. We also try to manage expectations, and we are clear that although we have found circles to be a transformative, useful process for individuals, families, and communities, it does not always end all conflict. It is not appropriate for every situation, and it certainly doesn't solve every problem. However, circles are an evidence-informed tool for working with individuals and families who have experienced domestic violence. Next slide. We want to acknowledge, yes.
Oh, go ahead.
No, please, Bree.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, we just want to acknowledge our funders, the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Justice, the New York University Research Challenge Fund, who have funded our research, as well as our research teams, members from NYU, the University of Utah, and Cambridge University. And finally, I know we're going to open up to questions now, but should anyone have any questions or comments that don't address now, please feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you so much. We do have some questions. The first question, Debbie asks, what kinds of crimes are eligible for CP, and how serious can the crime be in the jurisdiction where the models have been implemented?
So the models have been implemented in communities in which the cases have been misdemeanor domestic violence crimes. However, what's considered a misdemeanor domestic violence crime, I know varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And maybe Crystal, you can speak about this. I know in DC, for example, strangulation, I believe, is still considered a misdemeanor.
Yes. And so while that has been the context in which we've worked, that's also been a part of that was the community's level of risk they were willing to take. So we're not opposed to using this model in other cases. We just haven't worked with communities in terms of felonies before, because folks have been willing to start with misdemeanor and then decide on whether they'd like to elevate it to other crimes.
Great. Pat asks, where do you find these trained community volunteers? In Shreveport, Louisiana, we can't even find trained professionals who can help.
That's a real question. So the way that we think about our work is that we are the research experts. Our community-based organizations are the expert on the community context. So we actually worked really extensively with the community organization which we partner with to find community volunteers. Sorry, I just saw something in the chat. To find community volunteers, folks within the community that they know that might be willing to be a part of a process like this. What often becomes really surprising is there's often this hesitance. They're like, will we find anyone? And they always do, which has been really impressive to us. And then we work with organizations to actually train folks in our model.
And I was just going to, and when they do find people, it's people who are really engaged and committed to the process, because as we talked about, it's not a one-off circle. It's like circles over time, and these volunteers show up for every circle. And I think it really says something to the participants in the circle when they see someone showing up every week for their circle.
Next question, Donna asks, where did the funding come from for the implementation of CP in each respective state? And has the CP model continued beyond the studies?
So that varies from location to location. One of the things with domestic violence treatment for the most part is we are sentencing people to treatment and making them pay for it. And so in every location except DC, part of the funding comes from people have to pay as part of their sentence. They also have to pay for treatment. And then each organization has done things differently. You know, they've done fundraising, gotten grants. It really varies from location to location. The programs have continued beyond the studies. Nogales, the program has been around since 2004. It became Circles of Peace became its own community-based nonprofit organization. The model has evolved since we actually studied it there. So what it looks like now is a little bit different than what it looks like when we studied it. It's continued on in Vermont, as I mentioned. And Salt Lake City, I think we had, between the study ending the pandemic and then we lost a colleague there who was really involved in this work. So I would say right now it's not currently happening in Salt Lake City, but it has continued on in other communities.
Yeah, and we can also work with communities to acquire funding. That's one of the things that we have done in the past and are doing now.
Great. Laura asks if you have a copy of your research available to share so we can read.
Absolutely. We'll share with you, Catherine, our articles. Yeah.
Wonderful. Next question. John asks, what, if any, role has the defense bar played in relationship to the models? My experience as a RP practitioner who has worked in both prosecution and defense domains, is it more education and involvement of the defense bar is needed?
Yeah. Do you want to, or do you want me?
That, Crystal.
Yeah. So I think what this speaks to, and what we've seen in our work, is that every jurisdiction has a champion. in most of the jurisdictions we've worked with, it's either been a judge or a prosecutor. But and then the whoever it is that champion that's like that's helping us speak to stakeholders and really open up the community and other system partners to this work, will then have those conversations and help us have those conversations with the defense bar. So we've never in our work so far, I think it's fair to say that our champion has never been a defense lawyer. And they've typically been judges or prosecutors.
Great. Hannah asks, have you ever looked at CP in combination with other treatment court programs like drug courts or veterans courts?
No, but that would be really interesting to do.
Absolutely.
One of the interesting things that I should mention is when we were originally doing this work in Salt Lake City, we were working with a judge, and there was a dedicated domestic violence court at the time that we were working with the community, developing the model, training in the model, and subsequently got funding from the National Science Foundation. By the time everything got started, they lost the funding for the domestic violence court. And so there was no longer one judge who was seeing all the domestic violence cases. All of a sudden, there were now 6 judges, and the one judge who had overseen the domestic violence court convinced all the other judges to partner with us for the study and refer their domestic violence cases for the randomized control trial.
Yeah. And I should say, to add on to the previous question, while in our work, like that person hasn't been a defense, a part of the defense bar, that's not something we're not interested in working with. Yeah, so very open to all system partners who are, willing to advocate for RJ and this work.
Lisa asks, while victim participation is voluntary, is offender participation mandated? And is this part of post-adjudication proceedings?
So, sorry, say that question again. Sorry, Catherine.
Victim participation is voluntary. Is offender participation mandated?
Yes.
Is offender participation is mandated?
Yes, yes.
In the way that we worked with communities in developing programs, that doesn't mean that it couldn't be done with non-mandated population. It's just that that's where our work has been focused.
Yeah.
Okay. Is this part of post-adjudication proceedings?
Yes, typically in the communities that we've worked with, it has been a part of post-adjudication proceedings.
Okay. How has this model approached the reality of victim defendants? I live in an area with mandatory arrest laws and work with a number of harmed parties who have been charged with DV-related crimes. I've wondered how this approach impacts victim defendants.
I'll turn that to you, BB.
I think this is also, I think, one of the reasons for moving away from using that language and using like victim and offender. One of the other things, because we were doing randomized controlled trials, and this I think was specifically an issue in Utah, a lot of times there would be a dual arrest. And when there was a dual arrest, because we were doing a randomized controlled trial, we couldn't randomly assign both people to the program. So only the first case that came to the treatment provider would get randomized, and then the other case wouldn't be.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add, Crystal?
No, but I think, am I echoing? No, okay. I think that something that was brought up previously is this, made me think about multiple co-occurring issues. We are often dealing with folks that have mental health issues, that struggle with alcoholism, and when we say mental health issues, undiagnosed mental health issues. And what we've seen in this work is that the openness because often both offenders and victims have such a positive experience with circles, that they become even more willing to be referred to outside services that address other issues like mental health issues and alcohol or substance abuse issues.
Stephanie says, you mentioned that CP is not appropriate for every situation. Any further details on how to identify cases or defendants who are or are not good candidates for RJ/CP?
So, yeah, I mean, so we do assessments beforehand, and people have to be deemed based on a clinical assessment appropriate for being in a conjoint treatment program. And so if there's things as part of that assessment that deem the people not appropriate, then the case wouldn't be appropriate for circles of peace.
Yeah. And, when we say not appropriate, there are many folks that are mandated to treatment that to CP and initially don't want to be there. So when we say not appropriate, we don't mean like, we might think initially that, oh, this person isn't willing to change, but in the power of circles, we've seen many people who were resistant at first actually benefit from the process and change their perception of the circle process altogether. So that's not necessarily whether someone is willing to change is not necessarily something that would preclude us from them being allowed to participate in treatment, because we've seen that change over time.
JD asks, what are some good strategies for helping circle volunteers avoid burnout?
I know in Nogales, they do a lot of like potluck dinners in recognition of the role of volunteers. I think we've just worked in communities in which there's been really engaged community volunteers over time. And I think, one of the things is to have multiple volunteers, so it's not like the same person participating in every circle, so that you have several volunteers that you can draw on.
Okay, what are some good strategies for dealing with participants who stagnate or violate expectations?
And so circles get messy. This is a question we get a lot when working with communities. Is like, what happens when a person acts up, in short, and that happens a lot. And what we do, so we talked a little bit about the social compact, and this is an accountability plan that is updated week by week in circles. So I can give an example of, like, say someone came into circles, and since I was just talking about substance abuse, drunk or high, we deal with everything restoratively. So how would we deal with something like that in circle, where folks share on how this person showing up, not fully present impacts them. And in the accountability plan, in the social compact, addresses that, hey, in order to participate and be present in this space, you will not arrive to the circle high, or you will not arrive to the circle intoxicated, etc. And what we see is when folks are able to share their stories and how someone's behavior is impacting them, and from a non-shaming judgment space, but from an this is my story and this is how this is impacting me on an individual basis place, we found that folks have been much more willing to change and adapt their behaviors.
What are good screening criteria given the absence of sufficient resources to use the circle process in every DV case?
So typically we have a psychosocial or safety assessment that's provided by a clinician. That's why in searching for community-based organizations that we partner, either an organization that has some kind of clinical background or is willing to work with us to develop that capacity, that clinical capacity has been really important in this work, because typically those assessments will have some kind of clinical basis. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add, Brianna. Yeah.
All right, last question. What are some effective strategies to stretch resources in order to serve as many DV offenders as possible?
Yeah.
I mean,
That's yes, yeah.
So, one of the things that the pandemic has forced organizations to do has, to do circles virtually. And I would say the organizations that we've partnered with have done that successfully. And in some of the more like rural places, like in Vermont, it actually addressed barriers to transportation and other challenges to getting to treatment. But then it also brought up challenges of having adequate, internet or cell phone service and devices to be able to do things remotely. I think it's one of the reasons why, as the model has evolved over time, there's now more, the original model in Arizona was 26 weeks of circles for an individual case. There was no group component to it. It's one of the reasons why we were also, even though we had to adhere to the state standards in Utah, it was appealing to us because it was a way of using things that were already in place and adding a restorative justice component to what was already being done. And what was being done in a group component. And then as the model has continued to evolve over time, in Vermont, it's done in, a group circle. And that's why even now for DC, both the community circles and the educational circles are group approaches. It's only the last few sessions that involve bringing the two parties together that focus on an individual case. So that's sort of one way, is moving away from 26 weeks of like a circle for an individual case.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you for spending your time with us today.